Alright, this video is going to cover two objectives. We're still in chapter 10 and we're going to cover objective 7 and objective 8. So objective 7 is about different types of muscle contractions. Once again, we're talking about bigger scale in this particular PowerPoint. And so we have two main types of contractions that can occur in your muscles. We have isotonic and we have isometric. Okay, and so iso means the same, and we're going to see that something is staying the same in both of these. So a lot of times your big movements are a combination of the two, and so a lot of times we classify these based on which type of contraction is kind of dominating. And so we're going to start with isotonic. And so in isotonic concentrations, the tension is staying constant, but what's changing is the length of the muscle. And so in an isotonic contraction, there is going to be actual movement. We're moving something. The muscle is going to shorten and the load is going to be moved. And so these are going to be like when you're lifting weights, okay, or you're picking up something or you're moving something from one place to another. And in isotonic contraction, there are two types. There's concentric, which is when the muscle is shortening, okay, so this is going to be kind of like flexion. And then there's going to be eccentric, which is when the muscle is lengthening. So it's kind of going back to its normal length, or it's getting a little bit longer, and that's going to be like an extension type of movement. And if you think about like when you're lifting weights, I mean, it requires energy and muscle control to lift it, but it also requires muscle control as you lower it. Kind of like climbing upstairs and going downstairs. You're going to be using those muscles in both directions. But in one, the muscle is going to be shortening. That's a concentric contraction, and one, the muscle is going to be lengthening. That's an eccentric contraction. And so a lot of times you're producing that tension as you try to resist that lengthening. So as you slowly lower that weight, you can see that that muscle is getting shorter here, and the muscle is getting longer there. But in both cases, we are moving something, okay? We are moving that load. And then in isometric, this time we're going to have tension created, but this time the length of the muscle is staying the same. So we're not changing the angle of the joint, we're not changing the length of the muscle. And so these are going to be a lot of your control type of muscle tension. If you've done these types of activities, you know that they require a lot of muscle strength, but you're actually not doing anything. You're just kind of holding yourself. So doing like a plank or a wall sit, you don't actually have physical movement, but when you're sitting up against that wall, the muscles in your legs are working, and that tension is building as you just sit there. Without moving, you are building tension in those muscles. So the muscles aren't getting any longer, they're not getting any shorter, but they're just trying to hold that position. And so isometric contractions, they do involve the sarcomere shortening, but you're not moving a load. And so those muscles are working really, really hard, and the muscle as a whole is not really changing length. But you're building up tension, but we're not moving anything. And so a lot of these have to do with posture and stability, but you can actually use a lot of energy trying to maintain these positions. So just to kind of compare all three of them, so in isotonic, you have a shortening of the muscle, and you have movement. In eccentric, you have a lengthening of the muscle and you have movement. But in isometric, we're just kind of holding it in that position, and so there's no actual movement, but tension is going to be there. Same thing up here as you're lifting the weights. Here you're just holding it. There we're moving it up or down. Same thing over here in this picture. All right, so how do we generate muscle tone? Well, I mean, as you're just sitting there, your muscles are always partially contracting. There is constant tension produced by muscles over long periods of time. It's very rare that your skeletal muscles are completely relaxed, because if that were the case, you would be flimsy and you wouldn't be able to hold yourself up properly. You wouldn't be able to hold your head up, things like that. And so even when we're not physically moving, the muscle is going to be contracted at least a little bit. And so this kind of constant tension, constant contraction is what we call muscle tone. And so if you work out more, you will have more muscle tone than someone that does not. So as you're building those muscles, you can kind of see muscle tone in people's legs and arms. But even if you don't work out heavily, you still have some muscle tone, things that will help you keep your limbs and your back straight, things that will help you hold your head up and your abdomen flat. So this type of muscle tone is going to allow us to stabilize our joints and just maintain basic posture. All right, we're also going to cover objective 8, which is muscle fatigue. And I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point in time. If you've ever worked out in any type of athletics, you are definitely driven to the point of muscle fatigue. And this is where you just essentially decrease your ability to do work. It gets to the point where your muscles cannot function efficiently, so you have a decreased capacity to do the work and a reduced efficiency at doing the work. And literally your muscles just get tired. Your muscles can no longer contract. Even if the nervous system is telling them to, your muscles get to the point that they cannot continue contracting. Now, this is not fully understood 100%, but there are at least 3 different areas where this fatigue can happen. So it could be at the nervous system level, it could be at the muscle level, or it could be at that junction. So in the nervous system, this is probably our most common, but this is where we reach psychological fatigue. This is where you as an individual get to the point where you're like, I just can't do anymore, okay? The muscles could work, but you perceive that you are spent, that you cannot pick up another item, you cannot take another step, and so therefore muscle work is not possible because our brain is telling us we are done, okay? There could also be muscular fatigue where the muscle physically cannot contract anymore, and so this could be a calcium ion issue, or it could be an energy issue if there's no ATP. And so if calcium is not being reabsorbed and released like it needs to, if energy is running out, then those muscles cannot function like they need to. There could also be issues with lactic acid buildup, and we'll talk about what that is in the next video. Or it could be that you're running low on oxygen. If you're running low on oxygen, you can't make ATP as well. And so there's a variety of factors that could lead to muscle fatigue at the muscular level. But like I said, there are some things that aren't fully understood there. And then you could have synaptic fatigue. So remember that in order for muscles to get the message to contract, we have to get the information from the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And so if acetylcholine is being released really quickly and it doesn't have time to be remade, then eventually there's not going to be acetylcholine to continue to trigger those action potentials. And so if those synaptic vessels become depleted and there's not enough of that neurotransmitter, then the muscle fibers can't get stimulated. So it could be an issue with the neurotransmitters. Now, a couple other things that you might see when it comes to fatigue is sometimes you'll have what's called a contracture. And this is where the muscle kind of literally just kind of freezes up and it can't even contract or relax. You can kind of see that in your hands there. A lot of times this happens for a kind of a longer period of time. It's pretty much you run out of energy. And so remember that your muscles can't be released. If you don't have energy, those myosin heads can't release. And so it just kind of is this sustained state. You can also have a muscle cramp, and that is sudden, it's involuntary, and it is painful. Maybe while you're exercising, you could get dehydrated, you could run low on electrolytes, your muscles could just get tired and fatigued. Some illnesses or medications could trigger muscle cramping, but this doesn't last quite as long as a contracture, but it's definitely something that you don't want to get because they can be very painful. And kind of along with that, after we pass away, bodies become stiff, and that's called rigor mortis. And that once again has to do with the myosin cross bridges. And so what happens is after about 12 hours or a couple of hours after you pass away, that's when you start to see rigor mortis setting in. About 12 hours after you pass away is when it's kind of at its max. And then it kind of hangs on for about another 12 hours and then kind of slowly goes away over the next 12 hours. And so all in all, this stiffness can last about 36 hours up until the time the tissue begins to actually, degenerate. And so after death, what happens is there's no more ATP because once our cells die, they're no longer using oxygen and making ATP for energy. And so what happens is that active transport of calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum cannot happen. Well, if calcium stays in those sarcomeres around those myofibrils, then what's going to happen is those myosin heads can't detach. Because in order for that myosin head to detach and kind of recock, it has to have energy added. And so what happens is those myosin heads just stay in that position. And so that literally kind of just creates this sustained contraction, and that can lead to the stiffness. All right, we're going to stop there in this video, and we'll do one more video to finish up chapter 10.